Hi, everyone. Hi. I'm Sarah Whiting. Welcome to the first program of the GSD's fall lineup. So before we get to today's event, a quick reminder that we have live captioning available tonight for our virtual audience, because we are joined by a virtual audience as if this weren't enough people. This is a really full house. To enable captions, you virtual people, please click the close captioning button at the bottom of the live stream window. And those of you who are here in Piper can see that we have live captioning on this screen. Admittedly, the captioning isn't always 100% accurate, but it actually is truly amazing what the captioners do capture. And so I thank them and ask you for your tolerance. Finally, before we begin, I want to flag for you an upcoming GSD public program. Please do note that all information about all public events is available on the GSD's website. The fall poster, which was subject to the supply chain challenges of the paper industry, will be arriving any day now. So the next event will take place on Tuesday, September 13th at 6:30 p.m. here in Piper. Mistinguett Smith, founding director of the Black Land Project, will facilitate a participatory conversation about how race and land shape autonomy, community, and social and environmental regeneration. And the role of land is how I want to begin this evening's event. Our school, Harvard Graduate School of Design, is located on the traditional and ancestral land of the Massachusetts people, the original inhabitants of what's now known as Boston and Cambridge. Please join me in paying respect to the people of the Massachusetts tribe, past, present, and future, and in honoring the land itself, which remains sacred to the Massachusetts people. Oh dear. Are you okay? All right. I want to thank the Harvard University Native American program for their work in cultivating the relationships that led to this land acknowledgement. Now, acknowledging the importance of the land, its history, its culture, its geology, its topography, its colors, smells, sounds, and feel, lies at the heart of the work of tonight's visitor, the Muslim South African architect, curator, and teacher, Sumayya Vally. Co-founder and principal of the architecture and research studio Counterspace, Sumayya has multiple claims to fame, including being the youngest architect ever to be commissioned to design the Serpentine Pavilion in London. She was also selected this year by the World Economic Forum to be one of its Young Global Leaders, a community of the world's most promising artists, researchers, entrepreneurs, activists, and political leaders. So just imagine getting that phone call. We want you to be part of the World Economic Forum's Young Global Leaders. It's pretty phenomenal. And while I won't go on and on about her achievements, let me just note two more. So one, she's curating the first Islamic Arts Biennale, which will take place in Jeddah in 2023. And finally, she is overseeing the scenography, pavilions, and exhibition spaces of the Ellen Johnson Sirleaf Presidential Center for Women and Development in Monrovia, Liberia, which is the first presidential library dedicated to a female head of state. And did I mention that she's only 32 years old? Sumayya founded Counterspace with 4 other students when she was still a student at the University of Witwatersrand and the University of Pretoria. As an article on ArtNet explains, she had grown weary with the curriculum. We'll talk more about that this evening. But let's return for a moment to the importance of the land, of looking closely at the land. Sumayya's design thesis in design school and for her degree was a, quote, reimagination of an abandoned mine wasteland as a productive color factory. She used it to extract useful pigments and cleaning out the toxic waste locked in so many of Johannesburg's strategically located apartheid buffer zones. So for me, a successful thesis project is one that contains the seeds of one's core project and that seeds one's future work. Sumayya's thesis did that right away. It served as a springboard for the installation that Counterspace did for the inaugural Chicago Biennale, which was entitled Lost and Found, Phantoms of Spaces and Times, which used 90 petri dishes to display different pieces of forensic evidence of toxic mine waste in Johannesburg. In short, the thesis and then this subsequent installation address the exploitation of land and its impact on the similarly exploited inhabitants of that land. At the same time, these two projects carry an aesthetics, even a poetics, that seems almost impossible given the topic, but without which the project's message wouldn't have its same impact. Another topic for tonight's conversation. Now, it was Sumayya's choice to have a conversation this evening rather than delivering a lecture. It was also her request to join a class here at the GSD, and she did that this afternoon, taking part in Erica Naginski's MDes Narratives Pro Seminar. I can't say that I know Sumayya well. We met and worked together via Zoom on one of the wheelwright juries during the pandemic, and that was a great experience. But I do feel that I know her well enough to say that her choice to direct this evening towards dialogue rather than monologue is indicative of both her character and her practice. It's evidence of her generosity and her working method. Her Serpentine Pavilion was itself a conversation with other parts and populations of London. While the pavilion itself was located in its traditional site of Kensington Gardens, it included material from different neighborhoods housing migrant communities and also generated pop-ups across the city. Today, fragments of the pavilion live on in these different communities, in open spaces, in bookstores, and art centers. So the format for tonight is that we'll start with 2 short videos that Sumayya has provided. Then Sumayya and I will talk for a while, and then we'll extend the conversation further by opening it up to the audience. As I warned Sumayya in advance, I have 3 large topic areas that I'll dance around: practice, education, and then what I'll call being in the world, which sounds very Heideggerian, but that's not how I mean it. But this is not a scripted conversation, and so we'll see where it goes. First, let's start with the videos. Thank you.
I'm Sumayya Vally, and I'm the architect of the 20th Serpentine Pavilion. Counterspace is a design research practice based in Johannesburg, and we're focused on finding design form and design expression, which brings together a multitude of voices from across the African continent and beyond. The idea for the pavilion originally came about because I was really interested in being able to express stories of place and stories of migration across London. London is a place of extreme hybridity. Everyone is kind of an insider and an outsider. We all embody that condition in different ways. I spent a lot of time when I first came to London at the Bishopsgate Library and Archive, and I worked through their pamphlet collection. I looked at events that were taking place around waves of migration that occurred in the city. The most important part about this pavilion for me is that it's conceived in 5 parts. There is the structure that we're sitting in now in Kensington Gardens, but then there are 4 other structures that are embedded in the city across London. There is a stage set at the Tabernacle in Notting Hill, the headquarters for the Notting Hill Carnival. There's a fragment at New Beacon Books in Finsbury Park, a bookstore that was one of the first in the UK with a focus on Afro-Caribbean and African diasporic literature. There is a seat at the Albany in Deptford. And then there is a fragment at the Valence House Library in Barking and Dagenham. And that will form part of a hub that's going to be a radio station. These spaces are also really important in how they function for communities, that people take care of each other's children, that women come together. Within all of these structures of gathering, there are moments of intimacy and exchange, there are moments for one-to-one conversation, but also the pavilion comes together to form a set of larger gatherings. I hope that when people come to this pavilion, that they'll feel the spirit of generosity that's embodied in so many of these places. As a response to COVID, I was struck by the generosity of bodies who actively hold these spaces. And so Support Structures for Support Structures was born to support up to 10 artists a year working at the intersection of art and ecology, art and social justice, and art and the archive, through funding, but also through mentorship and skills support. It really feels like a triumph to know that this pavilion has become a shared platform for so many voices to come together, and this pavilion is very much about embedding itself in London and about being able to fold London into the pavilion and the pavilion back out into London. And that was something that was at the heart of the intent of this pavilion from the very beginning.
We need to ask ourselves if the world around us is being made in our image, and if it isn't, whose image is it being made of, and how do we start to make our own? When people are excluded or when stories are erased, it's a ravage of culture, a whole generation of thought that could have evolved out of that. My biggest inspiration is Joburg, for all of its energy, all of its challenges, and all of its opportunities. The softness that there is in the quality of light, which I think is something really special about the city. I spent big amounts of my childhood in my grandfather's store in inner city Joburg, and I vividly remember walking the streets of Joburg as a child and really being in love with it from a very young age. It is a place of so many other places, movements, cultures, and different forces. People have found ways to make the city home. I think it's a testament to how resilient people are. When we were invited to make a submission for the pavilion, I really wanted to reflect what someone like me from our context and from our part of the world could bring to this pavilion. And I think that's something that Joburg has given me, or something that I strive for in my work, is always trying to read beneath the surface. And I really wanted to reflect a London that is plural and that is about many different places, that honors voices from many different times, past, present, and future. The role of an architect is to be able to absorb, reflect, and translate who we are into the world. We need to be able to listen deeply to these silences and whispers. There's a whole set of worlds that are waiting to happen inside of them. I often think about our identities and how different the world looks from different perspectives. Architecture slanted in a very particular worldview that is very limited. And so I think that understanding how our different ways of being manifest differently visually, and then starting to explore what that can mean for architecture. My ambitions around building are very much about reimagining structures so that they reflect who we are, and we need to do that now.
Okay. So are the slides are you gonna have slides swapping through? Yes. Okay, there are gonna be slides going through. You can see this isn't super rehearsed. Very informal. So there will have slides of projects, and you can speak to those in your questions. So I wanted to sort of start with a couple soft general questions, and then we'll ease into more. So really with this question of genres of practice, because you talk of yourself as an architect and you've worked on buildings, but you're clearly expanded into curatorial work, what you call forensic work. You put a lot into narratives. And so if you can speak to sort of how you define practice as an opening, that would be helpful.
Yeah, I often, I think, get called and introduced as multiple different disciplines, as an architect, as a curator, as a researcher, as an artist. But whenever I introduce myself, I always say, hi, I'm Sumayya, I'm an architect. Because for me, it's really important to be able to claim all these other ways of working as part of the architectural discipline. And I think, especially coming from my part of the world, from Johannesburg in particular, it's really inspiring to see so many different ways of being embodied in the city. And I think that all of these things that make Johannesburg special and make it difficult and make it challenging, there's architecture waiting to happen in all of these things. And in a way, some of the other forms of practice or the other disciplines that I find myself engaged in, I want to say they're precursors to architecture, or they're part of an architectural discourse or part of architectural research, but I certainly see them as ways of drawing almost, or ways of exploring different phenomena in the city that can then be worked through in architectural form or in design form.
No, that makes sense. And so you say that you said in one of the videos that the role of the architect is to listen, but you also describe the role as bringing something out from yourself. And how do you negotiate that external obligation, is almost how you put it, and the internal voice?
I think they're very much related, and they overlap and interface quite a lot. And this is something that may sound grand, but architecture affirms who we are. It's something that we're all very much born into, and that most people who are not architects especially, but also people who are architects, take for granted, because we're all born into it. But the architectural forms that we have affirm who we are in the world. They affirm our place in the world. And again, coming from South Africa, I think that's something that's very visible, because architecture was a tool that was employed and deployed as part of the apartheid city planning strategy. So certain forms of architecture and urban and city planning really enforced the hierarchy for how certain groups feel. And what that does is it starts to become part of our subconscious. And we're constantly in dialogue with architecture. So we see or we feel ourselves through our built environment. It affirms our place in the world, and then we're in dialogue with it. We evolve our sense of belonging and identity through how we navigate. And that's why I think it's really important that on an embodied and intrinsic level, we do start to explore forms that somehow are more intrinsic and more resonant with our ways of being.
I like that. I like how you bring in the reading of form. I'll turn back to landscape and territory first, and we'll return to talking about form. But at one point you speak of reading under the surface and understanding a site really, or territory, through landscape or through the earth itself and how it's been manipulated. That's part of what I was talking about with your two projects, the Biennale project and the thesis. And I guess one question would be, what's just talking sort of broadly about your process of approaching a site and approaching a project, and how you combined the ability to read the land and then the ability to put form on that land or within that land.
That's such a difficult question.
I'm still at the easy part.
I'm sure everybody's also working through and thinking about that for their own forms of practice. Yeah. I think for me, research is a really, really important part of the work, and it really drives and leads everything that I do. Mm-hmm. Spending time in a place is incredibly important. I'm also thinking about this, for example, in Jeddah. I'm partly based there now, and I'm there for half of the month mostly. And I've started to notice when we, for example, bring artists along for the first site visit, that their observations I have very much internalized in a way, and I'm starting to almost feel like there are aspects of the culture of the place that I have embodied and have become a lot more familiar with, and have started to be able, I hope, to be able to read and absorb nuance in the landscape and in the space. And I think that that's something that doesn't come from a quick engagement. It's something that one has to be able to sit with, and that has to brew over time. It's also partly why I think working in person and being in person, as we all are here today, which I'm so grateful for, is incredibly important, because to have ideas within the Zoom bubble is, I mean, it doesn't work for me often. I do find that I have to be able to have dinner with someone and spend a day with them and, you know, spend a lot of time somewhere, and then ideas just kind of naturally evolve. But they're evolving in dialogue again with place, to speak about the relationship that the environment has on us. So I think there's something very important about being able to be in dialogue with the place. And I think when we talk about listening to place, that's very much what I'm interested in, being able to learn from the pedagogy and the tactics that are embodied and embedded in that place. And I don't know, I'm rambling and speaking abstractly, but I think that there is something, not just only in thinking about forms in place or forms that appear in culture. There are forms embedded and locked in the tactics that exist in different places. And I think that's really important, because often those tactics, those rituals, those ways of being have, for various reasons, been ravaged or been stopped or been colonized, and they haven't had an opportunity to evolve into form. They're at odds sometimes with the forms that we've inherited in our world. So yeah, I think it's...
I think that is a really great way of explaining sort of how you did the work in Johannesburg, and how you looked at the site and understood how it had been affected through the mining and how it affected the lives there, and sort of your project embodies the power of that site coming up. I guess one question would be, how have you translated that in the different places where you've now spent time? Because you've gone from spending so much time and being so beholden to and wed to and part of Johannesburg. And now you're spending time in London, in Jeddah, you're here today. How do you practice the way you want to practice with a more compressed amount of time, given that you don't have the luxury of the years and years and years you spent in Johannesburg?
Well, maybe the way that I answered the previous question is a little bit at odds with what I'm going to say now. But I think that there is still a reading of Johannesburg in every other place that I go to. And maybe that's a little bit unfair, but I think that there's something that's deeply important that Johannesburg can bring to everywhere. And so it's also something that I can't help, because I am formed by Johannesburg, and I'm formed by also the township that I'm from and grew up in. It's called Lodium. I'm formed by these places, and that is my lens of seeing and ways of being. And so those then I think translate and overlap with all of these other places. But when we spend time in other places, they also become a part of that. So that is also, I think, why advocating for hybrid practice is important. And, you know, by extension, I'm from Johannesburg, but as you mentioned in the introduction, my identity is also very hyphenated. My roots are from the Indian subcontinent, and so I also bring other hybridities with me. And those, I think, often resonate with these other places. London is very far from Johannesburg, but South Africa is a former colony, so there's also a lot of cultural resonance, and there's a lot that's important in voices that are coming from these other spaces into a space like London. So
I think that's very interesting, because you're essentially saying that there's and you constantly refer to Johannesburg and to the land and to the buildings there and the rituals and the tensions between the populations and how much that's formed you. But I think that you're also acknowledging that it's not just the site, but it's also your experience and your formation that you bring to the site and then travel with you. So I sort of, as you're talking, I imagine, you know, in 20 years, your own work will be a little bit like your thesis project of this sort of deep dive into a geological life stream, right? That you'll have all these lives accumulating in terms of a series of palimpsests and experiences that start to grow onto one another.
That's a really big compliment, because I hope that I am always able to listen and engage, and that I never become jaded and start to overproject. Although we do. We all do.
So actually that segues to a question that I had about how you collaborate with others, and sort of how, whether it's the example in Jeddah, or whether it's the beginnings of the Serpentine, or your collaborations with other populations in London. How do you go about practicing from the point of view of collaboration?
Collaboration is often, well, I think it's sometimes very difficult, sometimes very seamless, but it is somehow always important. And again, I think it is as important as it is to be in dialogue with place and to be in active dialogue with, for example, an archive or a site or an existing building. The voices of collaborators and people who occupy a site or who run a site or who live through the daily experience of being in that place are integral voices to the site. And so I think that collaborating then with a place means, by extension, collaborating with various people. It's also an extremely generative process to bring in other disciplines, and I know that sounds incredibly cheesy, but it's also very, very true. To think through the thing that you are looking at from a different lens can sometimes really also shift us out of the questions or the system that we're trapped by. But yeah, collaboration is also difficult because often when we set up a collaborative model, we imagine that it can continue in that same fashion. But we're working with participants who are active and growing in different directions. And so I think we also need to, if we're advocating for architectures that function more dynamically or that are process-led or that have fragments that exist in other places or sites that work in much more intelligent and agile and networked ways, we also have to think about how collaborations can be allowed to remain agile. And this is something I think that I'm continually struggling with as an architectural practice, that on the one hand is trying to be financially sustainable and successful, and I can't say that I'm getting that right yet by any means. But on the other hand, trying to stay agile and intelligent and in the working methods and pedagogy that the city is providing. Because those things are at odds. It's almost like the systems we've inherited force those collaborative methods or those intelligences to collapse. And I think we also really have to think about how architectural practice can be set up differently so that it does allow these things to remain agile and at the same time to grow and to be sustainable.
So in the architectural review, you wrote a letter to a young Sumayya, as if you weren't already young. And I wonder if you could either refer to that or elaborate on that here in terms of, because I mean, you all formed Counterspace while you were still at school. And I think we've talked a little bit on the phone about this, that there's a certain idealism and aspiration, and then there's the reality of forming a practice and trying to keep a practice going that you're referring to now, or you're sort of hinting at that. That's not always quite as smooth as one imagines it should be moving on. But maybe you could speak to a young Sumayya or to some of these younger people in terms of what you might give as advice having gone through this experience.
Of setting up a practice?
Yeah.
Well, I think that my advice is that you should just do it, honestly. And also,
Didn't Nike come up with that?
No, but also I still would advocate for working with your friends and for collaborating with the people that you are meeting at the moment, because that is still something that I reflect on as being an incredibly special, generative, formative time and experience. And I think that we need all of you to be out in the world making before you go elsewhere and become jaded. So, and I really, really believe in that. I believe deeply in it. And I think that I've never imagined that my practice is anything other than being part of a multitude of voices that really needs to take hold of the profession and transform it. And that is a project that has to happen at scale. I have a very small practice. And I think in some way and I know that it's a privilege to say this because I made many sacrifices that maybe many people aren't able to, and I did work a full-time teaching job, a full-time job, and full-time Counterspace all at the same time. But I would advocate for protecting a small space that you're able to pour your research interest into and your thesis project into. Working to keep that alive, because it is almost like a language, and if it isn't fed and nurtured and loved, it will also die. I'm very bleak.
Let's move on to a more uplifting topic. So Can you speak to, I mean, you've said several times now that there are certain things that need to change, or certain aspects that we've inherited, ways of working that needs to change. Counterspace was formed as a challenge to the curriculum, as I mentioned. Can you talk about that challenge maybe more specifically in terms of changes either in curriculum and pedagogy, I know you've been teaching, or in the world of practice and the world that we've inherited. So if you can be specific about where you want to cite your change, or how you've made change, or what you see that needs to be changed.
Yeah, so when Counterspace was formed, we were, as you said, all students. And I think there was something, it wasn't initially framed as an activist practice. But as I just said now, myself and my colleagues and friends were very, very excited about Johannesburg, very deeply in love with it, and we spent a lot of time being in the city, learning about it. We were extremely, extremely excited by Johannesburg. And I felt that when we were going to graduate, that love would not have a place to live anymore. I also, at the same time, was very frustrated, as you said, very uncomfortable, maybe is a better word, uncomfortable in my education broadly. I had many incredible teachers along the way, and I'm deeply grateful for them. But I think that the frustration or the discomfort that I felt was broadly about the curriculum, which is still something that we face today. And I think that came from seeing this incredible city with all of its richness, all of its diversities, all of its incredible ways of being, and then feeling a mismatch with what I was seeing and learning in the academy, which definitely felt very much behind what I was seeing in the city. So Counterspace was formed as a space to channel that love for Johannesburg, and to find ways to translate these things that I was seeing and deeply in love with in the city into practice and into form, and in a way to learn from these ways of making as a method of practice in the city. In terms of specific things in the curriculum, I think even just broadening the lens would be a start. And I think that's happening much more and more now in schools in South Africa. But when I studied, we learned very little, for sure, about Africa, about South Africa even. But we didn't learn anything about the rest of the global South either. I think I don't remember learning a lot about India or about Mexico, about so many other ways of being. And of course, the canon that we learned is incredibly important, but it was taught as if it's the only one. And also as if the history of architecture started and ended in a very particular timeline. So that's for sure one example, just one starting point. The other is, I think, to think about, and I keep repeating this, but really to look deeply at what methods are being offered in the context and how those translate. And by that I mean thinking through perhaps things that are more oral, more embodied, more to do with performance. And in Erica's seminar today, we looked at some of those things and how those can be worked with as pedagogical tools for then making form at the end.
How do you avoid fetishizing the vernacular or ruining it by focusing on it? I mean, I know that your love of Johannesburg isn't just the vernacular, but
yes,
that is part of what plays a role. Ritual, the aural, even that. How do you incorporate that without ruining it by suddenly turning it into something that you shape as opposed to you inherit?
I think often when we, and I'm just really thinking aloud, so however this
They're
comes
not
out.
here. Don't worry about them.
Often when we fetishize something, it is because we have particular tools that we inherit from one place, and then we kind of project those onto a subject matter, and it's almost like the medium and the subject are not intrinsic to each other. And I keep advocating for different methods, but I think that the methods we work through need to be right for the subject matter. And that's a part of why I practice, or I want to practice in so many different ways and so many different forms, because all of those forms, whether it's film or whether it's working through soil samples or, I don't know, working curatorially with a certain set of themes about a particular site, those are all methods of exploring different ways to draw things out of something. And there's a process of abstraction that happens in there that is different to, and this is just a personal opinion, it's different to fetishizing in a way, because I think fetishizing does feel very much like it's a process of framing rather than a process of generating.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it, actually. I think that's really key. Talking about being in the world, it's partly that you've set yourself up, partly the whole formation of Counterspace, and I think a lot of your practice has been arriving as an outlier. You use that term quite frequently, and we talked about this a little bit also on a Zoom, which I know is not the best format, but still, you've gone from being an outlier to being featured in Time, in Vogue, in Wallpaper. How do you deal with that?
I still feel like an outlier. I genuinely still feel like an outlier. So, yeah, I think even now, I still feel like my practice is sometimes misunderstood, and certain aspects of the way that it's framed or why it's framed, or also the way that the practice is introduced. Not tonight. I just mean, thank you so much for the warm and lovely and wonderful introduction.
Good save there, Sumayya.
No, genuinely, I mean it. But it does feel like I think I do still constantly navigate being misunderstood or being a figurehead or instrumentalized in certain ways. So I still feel like an outlier. But I'm not dismissing perhaps the privilege or the growing agency that I hope to have, and I think that that's important to be able to work with. But I think it still does feel difficult. And every time I have a new project, it feels like I'm still speaking into a vacuum. I'm still contending with all of the same forces, and maybe the scale of the project or the context of the project is shifting, but it does still feel like there's a lot of translation work to do because the methods of practice are not generally accepted. So sometimes advocating for them, it feels the same as when I first started my practice and I was advocating that it's an architecture practice at all.
Can you speak specifically to the experience with the Biennale, with the Jeddah, with the Art Biennale, of what it's been like to step into that role of a very significant curatorial role for the first Islamic Art Biennale, right? That it's a very significant stage. And can you speak to how you negotiated sort of outlier, insider in that, or how you're doing that right now?
It's been an incredible experience, and I've been also deeply humbled and honored to be working alongside incredible curatorial colleagues. I think the mix that we also have is really interesting. So I'm working at the moment with an archaeologist, Dr. Sert al-Rashid, an Islamic scholar, Dr. Julian Raby, and an Islamic object expert, Dr. Amne Abdelbar. All of them bring very, very different skills. And I think being able to be in conversation with those skills has also shifted the way that the curatorial practice or process is working. So we have historic objects that, for example, contemporary artists are responding to, but not in a historicized way. They kind of hold their own grounding, and the contemporary commissions are then much more about an experience around a ritual. There are many works that are also oral performance-based, that are embodied and inhabited. So they're not trying to do the same thing, but because they're in conversation and because also the artists have access to working with an archaeologist, intense site visits or road and research trips that, as part of what's being afforded curatorially, it's also shifted the way that the curatorial process is working, which has been really exciting and generative for me. In terms of being an insider-outsider, I'm not a curator, I'm an architect. But I think that my practice is really interested in piecing together different pieces of archive and different, time scales also, past, present, and future, and thinking about how they overlap. I hope that the Biennale does have an architectural edge. I think many of the works will be quite large scale, and many of them will also be experiential. So I think that there's also things that architecture can bring to curatorial practice that might also be very interesting. I also think that because it's an Islamic Biennale, I don't feel on the outside of that.
Right.
I feel very much on the inside of that experience. And I thought really deeply about what that can contribute to discourse. And we talked about it today in Erica's seminar as well. There's been so many definitions of Islamic art, and there's also been so much hesitancy actually towards the title when I presented it on platforms to many people. But I think that there's a strength to be had in offering a different definition of what Islamic art is and what Islamic art can be for the region, but also for the world. And by that, I mean, I think, again, to think about these forms as precursors to form making or ways of drawing. I think that there's so much to be had, and there's so much that's generative to think about from philosophies in Islam that can be translated creatively and into artworks that can offer reflections for people, for everyone, Muslim and non-Muslim. And that's been really, really interesting to think about. Beyond the definitions that we have that are largely based on style or tradition or geography for Islamic art, I hope that this is going to be a different definition to the discourse.
That's super exciting. I think both for the region, as you say, but also broadly. And I think super exciting to be part of that generating of that definition. I am very much looking forward to seeing what comes out of that. I am aware of time and want to permit this slightly squirmish audience who are forced to get used to sitting in chairs in a public place again, to engage actively in the conversation as well. So I want to open the floor to any questions. Are there mic runners, Matt? Of course there are. There are mic runners. So if people have questions, yes.
Hello, Sumayya. Thank you very much for the presentation.
Sorry, who's talking? Can you? Hi. Hi.
Yes. Thank you
Hi,
very
Karit,
much.
how are you?
I'm doing good. How are you?
Good. Nice to see you.
My question is about the city, the African city in particular. In the next 20, 30, 50 years, there will be a lot of change, particularly people moving into cities. And I think it's quite obvious opportunities that will come with it. But at the same time, there's all these problems that we would have to confront. And so my question is, how do you think the role of the architect is going to evolve to face these issues as they come up, both opportunities and issues?
Well, I think that the role of the architect is, I hope it's evolving, but I think that the way that it's being taught largely means that it isn't evolving in relation to these things. And I think we're still behind in many, many ways. So in a way, I think what you're asking about in terms of the city and the challenges that it has and the opportunities that it has is the starting point for us to think about the role of the architect. We should be thinking about how our profession is learning from that so that it can shape the future of it. Yeah, I'm not answering the question, but I think that it's an active practice to be able to define the role of the architect. Also, I mean, I think that there are so many avenues to define the role of practice at the moment, and there are so many different forms and ways of working as an architect. I was just in a 3-day seminar at the World Economic Forum, and all we talked about was the metaverse.
That sounds horrifying.
I can't comment. But there was also a lot of, I think it feels like there's often a lot of talk about practices becoming irrelevant in the face of the new world or in the face of what's coming. And I don't know how I feel about the metaverse, but when I was sitting there, I was thinking so many architects talk about being irrelevant in relation to that. And if it is the three-dimensional internet, architects are going to be really valuable. Also, you know, I think especially if we do learn our craft generatively, if we are thinking about how to teach architecture so that it is beyond learning about just door swings or just formal construction alone, and it starts to become about how we think through things, then we really are going to be prepared to design for many different scenarios and situations.
All right. Sad. Yep.
Hi, thank you so much, Sumayya and Dean Whiting, for the conversation. I've personally resonated a lot with what you said earlier about continuing a thesis project beyond the perimeters of a school and it leading to a larger research in the future. And just to continue a bit on the increasing discourse on decolonizing curriculum or decolonizing pedagogy in general, and sort of linking it outside of pedagogy itself into curatorial practices and into practice itself. Of course, with the growing number of art biennales, it being the Jeddah one and the Sharjah Triennale as well, and others in Mexico and South Asia, though they may be autonomous in nature and that they're very local, yet they respond to a larger issue that also deals with decolonizing pedagogy. How do you see that seeping into your practice and seeping it back into school and what we learn here in school and back and forth, and what can we learn from that?
I was actually just saying to Sarah in an earlier conversation that I actually feel like curatorial practice is very pedagogical. And I've been on a very long sabbatical now from teaching. I'm going to start again this month. But I have found that working on the Biennale has also felt like it's a continuation or a part of my pedagogical practice. I think it's very important for me, at least, that pedagogical practice and the studio practice are always running alongside each other because they do naturally feed into each other. And in a way, and I know that there's also a lot of feeling or talk about projects like biennales and pavilions and so on being whimsical and wasteful, and I think that that is partly true because of the way that many of them run. But I think places for experimentation and pedagogy and asking questions are incredibly, incredibly important, because otherwise we fall into only being solution-focused for the present without having an imagination or projection or set of critical reflections on what the future can be and can look like. And pedagogy is an important slow space for thinking. It is where we can be more radical, where we can be free of so many constraints. And I certainly feel like working at that slow speed with exactly the same question as the practice is working through. And my practice, because I do so many very small things and many instantaneous things, like this project, for example, it works at a scale where you're allowed to test things very quickly and very boldly. And I think having the space to work between those two things is very important. If we only are in the pedagogical or research space, then we start to become too removed from the reality of being in a place. And if we're only in the practice space, then we become too constrained by living only with, I think, constraint and challenge. So it's really important that those things liberate each other.
Thank you.
Jay had a question in the same row, so you can pass it down.
Thank you. I was really struck by your repeated use of the phrase different ways of being in the world, and the way that translates into what I read as a kind of formal language of heterogeneity in the projects. And I'm, that kind of heterogeneity or seeming casualness to the composition of the work belies, I would imagine, a real precision in their construction. A precision that is normally associated with conventions of architectural drawing. And so I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about the role of drawing in your work and whether or not that sort of interest in new ways of being in the world or diverse ways of being in the world translates to the production of the work through drawing.
Yeah. I believe very much in the production of the world through drawing. Again, I made a grand statement. But I think that there's so much to be said for paper architecture and for the value of the thought living through drawing, and the kind of sustained or the longer term effect that has on a form of practice. I think if it's considered and frequent, the production of drawings and the continued investment in different kinds of ways to draw, that does feed into later projects. And sometimes when aspects of things aren't able to be realized, they continue later in other projects. Sorry, I'm speaking really abstractly, but I think it's really important to have a sustained and diligent practice of drawing, and also to continue to evolve that practice of drawing. And I also use the term drawing very broadly. Of course, I think that many things that I make, I also see as a form of drawing. So if we think about drawing as a way to absorb something and then reflect on it through a method of drawing or making or filming, those are all forms of drawing that are somehow trying to synthesize information. And I believe very much in different methods of representation as forms of drawing. So in the architectural studio, yes, I think the construction drawing is incredibly important, but it's also important for the construction drawing to hold the concept. I once gave a lecture where I entirely read out construction drawings, because I really also believe that that's an incredibly powerful tool that we have at our disposal. And it's also our responsibility to be able to use and manipulate that to form and create the poetics that we want to have and we want to see in the world.
Hello.
Hello, my name is Ala, and here. Thank you so much for such a rich conversation. I was really intrigued by what you mentioned about tactics and their existence in multiple places. And my question is really focused on the city of Jeddah, since you mentioned that you spent pretty much half of the month there. And Jeddah being not only a religious and also economic hub, but a city that is pretty much shaped by multiple historical, cultural, and architectural layers. And I'm really curious about what you think, or the connection that you found that pretty much linked to Johannesburg in Jeddah.
Wow, to Johannesburg. Yeah, well, it is also a place that is completely synonymous with migration, as you said. And the theme for the Biennale, which is called Aural Bait, and when I was approached for the project, part of the mandate for the project was to showcase Saudi as the custodian of the two holy sites. I started to think, yes, it's the custodian of the two holy sites, and it is the source of so much about the faith and the religion. But it is also, in a way, suspended from geography and politics, in that it really belongs to the entire world on a spiritual level, but also, I think, rightly, as you mentioned, because the entire world has passed through it. And this reflection, Awwal Bayt, or first house, which refers to the Kaaba in Mecca, is also, I was interested in interpreting it as this place that somehow we all have a relation back to. And if we think about, for example, Malcolm X and Radical Politics of Love, there are many South African freedom fighters and struggle heroes as well in that same realm. Also, thinking about Jeddah and its food culture, and we were talking about this also earlier today, and I think reflecting on the letter and thinking about other forms of archives that are held in recipes, for example, in so many forms of culture, in recipes, dialect, language, sound, the way that gathering spaces are created and the choreographies and infrastructures for gathering. Jeddah really, really holds such hybridity because the entire world has passed through it. And for example, Jawi food or Indonesian food is very much Jeddawi in a way. And that's something that the Biennale certainly reflects on. So in two parts, on the one hand, it reflects on the construction of spiritual belonging and on unpackings of time and our relationship, or the way that our rituals are synchronized in relation to the cosmos, but then also really thinking about how community is constructed and how cultural belonging is fostered through things that have passed through this place. So that's, you're absolutely spot on. I think it is definitely a place of so much hybridity, and that's certainly something that's drawn me to the project, but that I've also found very resonant with Johannesburg and with London.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hello, my name's Hadley, and I would just like to thank you for being here today. I have a quick question about the Serpentine Pavilion, which we saw in the video. I had the chance to visit and noticed there was a significant sonic element as well. I wondered if I could ask you, why did you include audio with your architecture? And how was that significant to your overall design ethos? What did that add in your mind? Would love to know a bit more about that in your play. Thank you.
I'm so glad and grateful that you got to visit. Can you tell me what sound piece was on when you were there? Can you describe it?
Pop quiz.
I don't know if I could cite it specifically, but it was this sort of low melodic rumbling of voices in the background.
Voices?
Yeah.
Do you remember what accent it was?
You're testing my memory. It was almost a year to the date.
What month was it?
It was October.
Okay, that was Tokwase Dyson. So, there's the sound commissions, and I think because of COVID, I had more time to work on the project, and it was already submitted to planning. So the design was in a way frozen, but the project grew lots of different layers and many extensions through relationships with the Serpentine team. And I met everybody who was working at the Serpentine at the time, all the curators from all the different departments, and many of the producers who work in other aspects of the Serpentine as well. And the Sound Commission project, my practice is very interested in sound, and I often use it and work with it as an experiential force. I also am really interested in translating and working with different forms of sound and thinking about how that can shape space or shape experiences as well. So that's something that's there. The sound pieces were commissioned because, it came about, I can't exactly say how, but there were several things that were happening at the time. It was COVID, and we were thinking about people coming to the pavilion that was meant to be a gathering place, and I'm very lucky that it did get to live as a gathering place, even though, we weren't sure what was going to happen because nobody knew what it would be like when it opened, because we were living through COVID. And having other voices present in the pavilion was a way to bring through a human presence if that extent of gathering was not going to be possible. Thankfully, it was possible. But then I also started to enjoy the element of working with voices who could not be present in the project. And so some of the artists also started to work with voices from the past or memories from some of the places that the pavilion touches on, and places that informed the pavilion. Ian Bailey worked on a piece called that was about Railton Road in Brixton, and there were many voices that had reflections on that place. There was a commissioned piece by Matthew Phillip, who I also collaborated with at the Tabernacle, as part of Ian's piece that he played on the steel pan. As a way also, I think, to include that, or these sets of voices in the pavilion in a very, formally I hope that the pavilion honors these voices from the past in that way, but then bringing in actual collaborators is another way to do that. And we also thought about voices from the future. Jay Bernard's piece worked with children all on the same road, with very varied experiences of life in London. And so that became a really integral part of the memory of people who came to the pavilion. And as a learning experience and as a generative form of practice, it was also really amazing to get to work with Brian Eno, Jay Bernard, Ian Bailey, and Tokwase. So I feel like through that process, I also learned a lot. And sometimes it does feel like collaboration is quite selfish because it's a process of continual learning in that way.
Thank you very much.
Hi,
You'll
Sumayya.
be next.
Thank you. We've spoken a lot about outputs today, and outputs of your work. Amazing, of course, but I'm really also curious about the inputs. Is there a book or a text, a poem, it doesn't matter, something that you think that everyone here should read, and how or where you've encountered this piece of input? Doesn't have to be the only one, but just pick one, maybe.
No, I'm gonna really sound like I'm repeating myself over and over and over again. I think there are many texts that I hope find their way into my practice, but the thing that I think everybody should read is The City, or actually is Johannesburg. And that is the biggest input for my practice. I hope that it's able to continue to absorb and embody those conditions, and I hope it's able to somehow serve and honor them as well.
If you can pass the mic down. Yep.
Hi, I have a question regarding your own definition of Islamic art and architecture. I do agree that what you said resonated a lot with me, that there are multiple definitions and ways to look at it, and I would love to hear how would you define it?
The way that I'm working to define it is through embodied experience and ritual practice. And so many of the commissions that we have reflect on philosophies in the faith, or rituals in the faith, or practices in the faith, and then translate those into experiences. I know that's very abstract. I unfortunately can't share the works in the Biennale, but hopefully when I come back next year, I'll be able to show you some of it. I guess what I'm saying is that we have definitions of Islamic art that already think about grouping things through objects or through styles or through geographies, and this definition that I'm working through at the moment, I think, doesn't do that at all. It's really reflecting on spiritual practice and communal rituals, and I hope that that's somehow going to be resonant with every Muslim and non-Muslim, with people's daily lives and daily forms of practice.
Okay. Oh, okay. Now, see, this is what happens. We get closer to the end, and all of a sudden everyone warms up. Diego, and then our visitor from MIT.
Thank you. Hello, Sumayya. Hello, Sarah. I have one short question. I wonder what you think happens when somebody experiences work like the Serpentine Pavilion in person without being informed of you, your story, and your intentions. Thank you.
Well, I don't imagine or expect that somebody knows or cares about the story when they come to the pavilion, and I think most people don't. But so for me, it's important that it offers a beautiful experience. And I worked, how do I say this? When I worked on research related to the pavilion, I spent a lot of time in archives, and I also worked with a lot of information, or a little bit of information, because the information was scant, about places that don't exist anymore. And I worked on modeling them up and drawing them out. And I hope for the architectural profession that the story of the pavilion and the story of these places and the importance of these places is brought to the discourse. But for perhaps people who are outside of our discipline and just visiting the pavilion, I worked to embody a lot of what I think are gestures of generosity from these various places, in how they facilitated gathering and in how they brought people together through small gestures, whether it's, for example, an overhang or canopy over a market stall where people trade and transact, or it's, as you're sitting now, the way that people gathered on porch steps in Brixton during the time of protest and so on. There's no furniture that was brought into the pavilion for people to sit on, and people really did interact with the surfaces of the pavilion. So I don't know what anyone felt, but I do hope that they experienced it as a generous space to gather and to see and meet other people. There were many, many events, curated and spontaneous, that I saw at the pavilion that left me deeply humbled. But for me, it's not extremely important that everybody knows the intricacy of all of the stories that contributed to the pavilion. That's important for me and my practice and my own learning. My transmission of that into the world, I hope, is a beautiful experience for people. But that's all we can hope for.
Hey, Sumayya. Nice to see you outside of South Africa. So this is, look, selfishly, we really like that you're here. But my question is, when we start to think about going home at some point, how do you see kind of the practice in Africa evolving? Do we decentralize the academy? You know, what's the future of education in architecture for us on the African continent? Yeah, that's, I know it's a broad question, but I think you are the person to answer this right now.
Oh, no, God, no. We are the future of architectural practice and canon. I really believe that. I think also, I mean, of course, Leslie Loco and the African Futures Institute is an incredible initiative, and I'm very lucky. I didn't get to talk about this when we asked about canon, but I taught at the Graduate School of Architecture in Johannesburg for 6 years. I was there when Leslie started the school, and that was really with the intent of creating a curriculum entirely for the continent. It was an incredible experience, and I think the things that I'm saying, I hope are embodied in there, because we really did work with not so much, and Leslie said this often because she brought the unit system from the AA to South Africa. She said she wasn't interested in what the unit system would do for Africa, but what Africa would do for it, and how it would really offer different methods of engagement and different pedagogical tools. And I think that all of those methods of making and ways of being and ways of seeing are really there, and really they are the future. So in a way, I think we're the future.
There.
Thank you, Sumayya, and Professor Whiting for the dialogue. With regard to the state of being that you were repeatedly, arriving on, and as against the inherent hybridity that you are trying to seek, I'm interested to know what sort of impact has your own personal transcultural history and your background has informed the sense of being, because I can see that there's a lot of sense of becoming as well, simultaneously with the sense of being. So I'm interested to know what sort of a transcultural backdrop do you hold behind when you begin to draw, or when you begin to articulate these geometries that are coming up?
Well, I think, as Sarah also mentioned earlier, that hopefully when we are in a place, we also start to accumulate many, many, many different layers. So everything that we've inherited and what our ancestors have given us, and all of our mother tongues, my mother tongue is unfortunately English, which is also in a way saying something about hybridity. I think we're not divorced from the contexts that we inherit, and we're not divorced from the forms that we inherit either. So for me, that's what hybridity really is about. It's about being able to negotiate these many different forces in the same realm as a generative dialogue, without, I don't want to say without polarizing, without thinking about them in a binary fashion, let's say. And I think that there's a lot of power in that, because when we're able to embody that, then we can speak across many different contexts, and we can resonate across them without necessarily excluding certain contexts and including others.
It's hard for them. Here, the mic is in the front. Perfect.
Hi, Sumayya. Thank you for coming. This conversation has been absolutely wonderful. I was hoping to kind of hear more about the role of scale in your architectural authorship. You're able to execute the power of the monument at the scale of the mundane, and packing such large, sweeping architectural gestures in such small and deliberate moves. I was hoping that you could speak towards how you negotiate that, and how that logic could then extend to the development of the image of the African city.
Wow, that's such a huge question, Mariama. I think I've worked at certain scales because that's what I've been offered. And but I think that working at all these scales is really powerful, and being able to test interventions at a small scale is an experiment or rehearsal from working through something than, say, at a city scale often. I'm thinking here about the pavilion, which has a building at Kensington Gardens, but then has these small domestic scaled spaces in other locations. Domestic furniture, let me say, not domestic like a house size, much, much, much smaller. I've learned a lot about that kind of diasporic logic of working with something that has a preconceived function that is largely decided by me in relation to research, then being negotiated and worked through with a place and with a client, and then living in that place and having dialogue with it and starting to grow and accrete different meaning, and then partly moving somewhere else and also growing in function. For example, the fragment that we developed at the Tabernacle had a set of iterations at this year's Notting Hill Carnival, which just launched a few weeks ago. And so I think that learning experience of being able to test out working at that scale has been very important, but more importantly, and I'm saying this because of your question about the continent, working through that logic, which for me felt like a diasporic logic, or maybe some people would consider it ephemeral, but really thinking about something that is process-led, that implicates form and implicates architecture, but also, is programmed, is activated in collaboration with many other people and so on, and also has a network and a relationship with other pieces and brings people from different institutions together to work collaboratively. Those things were, for me, all really interesting, and I hope that I'm able to implement those methods at a larger scale. I'm trying with the Biennale for sure, and this time also across geography between Jeddah and things happening in other contexts or countries, or how certain commissions can maybe be pedagogical and work in different schools that are not in Jeddah but in Pakistan. I can't say more about that yet, but I think it's been a really it's been a really great learning to work at a small scale and then work to translate that idea, or think about how that idea could translate to a larger scale. And I think this is something that's important for us as young people, is that we shouldn't shy away from any opportunity to work on something, no matter how small the scale is, because those are really rehearsals for things that can happen at bigger scale.
Last question. Front row.
Hi, Sumayya. Thank you so much for a really wonderful discussion. I guess if the first question was about the future of the city, my question will be about the past. I want to get at this idea about looking under the land and the rewriting of histories. So in the context of post-colonial, post-apartheid, or post-imperialist cities or territories, to the extent that we can call those processes over. I'm curious about this idea of archiving and designing archive, or designing methods of rewriting histories that have been made invisible or have been made obscure beyond kind of what we can even read in the city. So at a sort of higher level, what is the process of rewriting histories that have been made invisible, and what do you think are the sort of on-the-ground practices of elevating either oral histories or, archival imagery? What is the process of rewriting in your practice?
Every project is really an opportunity to do that, and I think that some of the projects are architectural, but others might be, as I said, filmic or drawing-led, or relate to photography and mapping, or relate to food and recipes and their different geographies, or relate to soil. I think that all of these different methods are forms of archive. Do you want to read the letter? Is that pretentious?
No, do you have it with you?
No, but maybe we can stop on the slide.
Is it? So if we can, Matt, can we get to the slide that's the letter? Can you read that?
No.
It's bigger up there.
Yeah. Does someone else want to read it? You read it, Charik.
Oh,
yeah.
I'll read it.
Okay. Oh, there we go. The beauty of a iPhone capture. Oh, she's outsourced it.
Okay. Oh, all right. Dear younger Sumayya, there is always architecture waiting to happen in places that are overlooked. You will soon fall in love with gold, kitsch, supernatural ideas, with very strange and everyday things. A disco church on wheels in the inner city, the performance of a ritual gathering on a patch of
felt grass
of a traffic island next to a highway, the rhythms and space of an Ethiopian coffee ceremony, the smell before a high-veld thunderstorm, the choreography of Fordsburg on a Friday before, during, and after prayer time, the specific color spectrum of a mind-dump sunset, the tenacity of indigenous plants and indigenous ceremonies and practices, all the magic that is Joburg. There is another canon here. And just atmospheres, learn how to read and feel color, dust, mist, the phases of the moon. There is another canon here. Look at these things deeply, feel them, absorb them. You will soon develop a mistrust for the historical record. Listen to that. Look so deeply at what is present that you notice the silences and the absences too. There is yet another canon here in these silences and absences. Read in other languages. Write in your mother tongues. Look deeply at sentence structure and vocabulary. There is another canon here. Learn how to dissect the index of an archive and how to make your own indexes for archives. Stay soft and sensitive. It is a deep strength, and architecture needs it. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise. Don't listen to anyone who tells you that everything you can ever imagine has already been done. They are incorrect. Beauty and social justice are not mutually exclusive. Beauty is social justice. There is an infinite number of untold stories, unheard voices, unrealized dreams, undreamt worlds. Poetry is a necessity, and dreaming is everything. Love, older Sumayya.
Okay, that's a very long, rambling list. But I think what that's saying is that there are all these things in my city, in everything around us that really are archive. And I think we need to think about different drawing methods and different tools that can hold those forms of archive, whether it is the ritual or the ephemeral or the embodied. We need to learn how to reckon with them and draw them so that we can translate them into architecture, because architecture really is, all architecture that we currently have is also an abstraction of things that are intangible, or certain ways of living, ways of being, systemic knowledges, hierarchies that are set up, even if we think about a setup like a lecture hall, for example. So, you know, it's not to say that there's anything grand in those statements. I think what I'm saying is that in many cultures, the oral forms of dress, the atmospheric, those are really important ingredients for making space, and learning how we can include them and use them to push the discipline and push form forward is something that I think is important.
I think, I mean, I have to say all the questions were incredibly valuable in drawing things out, drawing themes out. I think that there's, for me, something sort of, it's quite extraordinary to watch, and it was good to read the letter, because you navigate across many scales, to go to the scale question, many mediums, many things that are very ephemeral, many memories. And so you have this amazing breadth that you sort of gracefully move across, but you, at each point, have precision. And I think that's why the letter was very useful to read, because it talks about that breadth and all of this list of crazy things. Some of those, like, so what's gold? What's there are a bunch of little things in there that I want to learn more about. But you speak of all these things as floating things that almost pass across a dreamscape, but with absolute precision, and with the precision of the craft of even writing that letter. And I think that that's where you've managed to maintain a degree of control over quite a fluid young career. And I think your generosity in sharing that was quite evident tonight. So I want to thank you for coming here. I want to thank you for your generosity in engaging all of us. And thank you for your work. So.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.